So thank you to all our panelists for agreeing to speak today on how do we actually define meaningfulness in machine learning and biology and medicine. Just to quickly introduce the panelists very briefly and then move on to the discussion. Pankaj Mehta is a professor of physics at BU and in the Faculty of Computing and Data Science as well. He's working to build models of large-scale biological systems, applying tools from statistical physics to the biological domain. Dr. Daniel Burkhardt is a machine learning scientist at Celerity, working to understand behavior of cells through multiple measurement methodologies and high-dimensional data, and is one of the primary organizer of the Open Problems in Single Cell Analysis 2021 NeurIPS competition. Aspen Hopkins is a PhD student at MIT CSEL, along with Serena Booth, another PhD student. They've done some really interesting work on responsible AI in smaller companies and looking at constraints, resource constraints, and shortcuts relative to best practices that those tend to introduce. And Dr. Brian Cleary is a Broad Fellow at the Broad Institute, developing new and highly efficient experimental methods to measure and perturb genes in order to better understand tissue physiology and cellular pathways. We have a lot of sort of questions we want to talk about and topics today, and Pankaj was gracious enough to sort of present some slides to sort of set some of the tones and start asking some of the questions that we're interested in discussing. So Pankaj, please go ahead and share your slides and open the discussion about how we do meaningful work in ML and biology.
So thank you so much for having this. It's, I think, really important to discuss why we do things in addition to what we do. And so, as I said, I'm a statistical physicist who became interested in biology about 15 years ago. I also, I think, was a pretty early adopter of the modern deep learning methods in what I do. But I thought before that we'd step back and think about science as an institution and what kind of questions we're trying to answer, because that was part of what I think the prompt was. And I think the first thing we should emphasize is that science is a social institution done by real humans who live and work in society. And I think, these are two of the most famous biologists that live near many of us in Cambridge. This was Richard Lewontin, who just died, who cloned the first gene, Ruth Hubbard, the first biologist, a woman biologist to get tenure at Harvard. And they have these quotes that I really like. The first one is, science, like other productive activities, like the state, the family, sport, is a social institution completely integrated into and influenced by the structure of all our social institutions. And the second thing is that Ruth Hubbard emphasized is about the kind of questions we ask and how we think about the world. Our world of facts is contextual, not only that it depends on who we are and where and when, but also in that it is shaped by where we want our facts to take us. And I would argue that any conversation about meaningful representations has to acknowledge that we're social institutions, and we have to think about the setting in which modern science is done. And so I would say one of the things that's really interesting about the era in which molecular biology and computer science and machine learning came of age is that it's an era where knowledge is instantaneously a commodity. It's the first time where you produce something and you can instantaneously try to turn it into something you can sell, but and more importantly, also in a way that you can instantaneously imagine taking something from the bench right to a therapeutic that might help people. And so you can see that around 1980, there's this big shift where business starts funding everything instead of the federal government. And at the same time, there's a new legal regime that's defined by two very important cases in biology. The first is Diamond Chakraborty, which allows people to patent organisms. The second is the Bayh-Dole Act, which allows federally funded research patents, federally funded research performed by university to be patented. And this creates a new regime of science organization, an academic corporate complex, which depending on your point of view can be viewed as very beneficial or somewhat troubling. And this is discussed at length in this kind of book, Science Mark Privatizing Science. So what I think is important about this is that the environment we reach and work in shapes the kind of metaphors we use and the kind of things we like to do. So for example, these are some stuff from Andreessen Horowitz. Vijay Pandey, who's a very famous molecular biologist, did a lot of computational stuff. And there's a lot of metaphors about Google, Google Maps, big data, machine learning. And I think this reflects to some degree the fact that we live in an age where Silicon Valley is very ascendant and big data is very ascendant in what we do and shapes a lot of what we think. And I think what I wanted to emphasize is that this kind of big genomics and the molecularization of life is very successful. It's clear, it spins off many products. There's many things that are happening, but it also is embedded with certain lacunae about how we think. I think it's extremely reductionist and molecular. It largely ignores contexts like environment, history, social factors. It gives primacy to the immediate actionable information for immediate translation impact, and hence tends to disdain abstraction and theory. And I think the modern machine learning, ML, and genomics is as much about automation and tailorization of scientific commodity production, as it is about creating knowledge. And we have to take these things into account when we discuss what a meaningful representation is. And so I would say that this kind of political economy has set, it's basically gives rise to a very empirical understanding of biology. And it's beautiful. We can measure things in a way we could never imagine before. And we're trying to organize all this information. And I think this reminds me as a physicist of Tycho Brahe, who took amazing astronomical observations. And you could really predict motions from all this stuff. And he organized this data. And it's only because of his observations that we got Kepler and Newton's laws. But I think my feeling as a physicist and my prejudice from my political inclination is this kind of reductionism, while amazing at some things, is incapable of treating abstraction holism, because I think it will be impossible to measure everything in every setting and memorize it. And I would argue that modern statistical models are much more about memorizing and automation than they are about intelligence. And so I would say we need something that moves beyond ML models to theory and abstraction. And so this is just my thoughts on the kind of science we do, how the context we do science in, more importantly, shapes what we do. And so thank you for your time and listening. Let me stop sharing now.
Thank you. Who wants to pick up on that? I think that any of those topics are fair game and very interesting and very relevant. Brian, I know that you have opinions on ownership of models, which was something that was sort of mentioned there. That models are currently something that are large, hard to share, and potentially sort of become proprietary very easily because of that, whereas theories generally are not.
Yeah, indeed. I think there's an interesting connection between how much we prioritize the sort of predictive mode of output of science and engineering versus the mode of output being theories that we can reproduce both across geographical scales and across generations. And there's an interesting connection there to what can be owned, especially in light of Pankaj's points about science being, part of, it's a social institution. It's connected to everything else in society. And so there are reasons that the direction of the field might tend towards one or the other. And in particular, one concern that I have with a mode of scientific output as being predictive models is that it's not just that it's related to sort of a reductive science or something like that, though I likely share all of Pankaj's concerns on that point. It's also that there are certain types of doing science that will tend to benefit some populations more than others and be able to include some populations more than others. And a particular type of science that I would be concerned about with these issues of equitability and participation in mind are how much do we prioritize big, expensive research studies that then require big, expensive analysis and don't produce a theory necessarily as output, nor do they have that as a goal in the end, versus how much do we do sort of theory-based science? And they're definitely different things, though, as Pankaj said, they all of these modes of studying a biological process can be useful at some level. It's just overemphasis on one versus another can have consequences as a result of the fact that, again, these are all part of big social institutions. So, okay, we're meant to be talking about meaningful representations here. So just to tie it back to that a little bit, I think that, a lot of work that's happening now is collect bigger and bigger data sets and run bigger and bigger analysis on it. And there's immediate recognition once you've done that on the latest and biggest data set that you should be able to get something from all your efforts other than having described the patterns in your current data set, right? The outcome of an experiment and analysis must convey something other than the data set itself and the patterns in that data set itself. And so people are looking into interpreting big models, maybe running more and more complex models, and then trying to scrutinize them to understand the patterns that are involved. But I think what needs to happen is a much more active effort to directly connect this sort of pattern discovery and organization of data to development of theoretical models. And one reason to, in a very scattered way, connect this back to what I was saying about sort of who participates in the benefits of science and the direction of science is that I tend to think of theoretical models as being inherently more democratic than big, expensive studies that generate big tables of parameters, where the sort of big table of parameter mode of output is an ownable product. And a theory is somehow inherently more democratic in the sense that it can be communicated across scales, and that it probably captures something true more than just a predictive model does. So yes, that was perhaps a bit random, but nonetheless, at least somewhat related to what Pankaj said and the topic of the day. Well, I think you're muted, Ray.
I'm muted. I get the prize for the first time. I think you're muted. Serena or Aspen, both of you have, so you've done work looking at sort of constraints in smaller companies and trying to do deep learning, who are obviously aiming for sort of a model that they own, that they can use, but also on interpretation, I believe. So I would love to hear your opinions on both those aspects. How do we understand the sort of competitive aspect of machine learning in a corporate setting or otherwise, and then also how do we find meaning in these models?
Do you mind if I start, Serena? Okay, I want to take a slight step back from just this idea of like long tail corporations to respond to something that Brian said that I think that really resonated, which is the more data that you have and the larger and more complex architectures that you have for these deep models, the easier it is for you to memorize, like for the models to memorize concepts. And I think one of the things that introduces is fragility of the model, right? And so when you think about these generalizable theories that we can come from. And I don't know exactly what it is that, Brian, you mean by theory. So I'd love to hear what you mean by that from the biology perspective. But when we talk about these generalized theories, I think it becomes like really, really difficult to do with these expensive toolkits that we're operating under. And so one of the nice things that I hope that we see with some of the democratization of machine learning is that when people have to operate within these like learning constraints, that they develop these better mental models of the space that they're working with, because they are engaging with it really closely and intimately to build translatability. So I'm gonna stop and like see if Serena has any additional context. I am so excited about this conversation, by the way. Everything that both Brian and Pankaj, did I say your name correctly, brought up, I think is just lovely. And epistemology of science in general is just something I hope we come back to later, because there's a lot of things that we can talk about from a data perspective and from a modeling perspective.
Yeah, a couple things I'll jump in with. So I work on interpretability research in large part, both for like neural networks in these toy domain problems, hopefully merging into more meaningful problems, and then also in robotics context. So something I'm excited about right now is trying to use interpretability methods kind of in the reverse direction to help like teach people the theories that neural networks might uncover. And I think this is like kind of dream world, right? I'm not sure. I believe that neural networks are actually doing a really good job of finding information that is useful. I think like largely, as Aspen has said, they are fragile, they are memorizing things. We're not going to find new conclusions from this. But to the extent that it's possible and that we allow ourselves to dream, I think, you know, some of these techniques can help us like learn new things ourselves if our interpretability methods work correctly. And so I'm very eager to like push in that direction in my research. And so try to extract the theories from the large models for some definition of the word theory. The other thing, just on, you know, the paper that Aspen and I wrote about these small corporations and how they're trying to go about machine learning research, it's like very silly, but the most common response we got when we emailed people and said, "Hi, we're two, you know, MIT PhD students looking to like hear about how you use machine learning in your company." And we would email this to, you know, people whose websites said all over them, machine learning, you know, we're doing the state-of-the-art stuff. And almost unanimously, we've got this reply back of like, oh, we actually don't do machine learning. And so I think there's this like, you know, push for funding and things like that going on, while also this like fear that many people have. They didn't necessarily go through like machine learning training in their education, but they're now working on it. And these things kind of collide. And so, you know, like, what are we able to do with the skills that we have as developers? Yeah.
Daniel, since we haven't heard from you, and Daniel, you're much more in the side of I think maybe like applying deep learning and methods like it to large data sets and generating these large data sets. So much more on the sort of practitioner. I mean, there are others among us as well, but I'd like to hear sort of your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I first of all, you know, really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this group, and I think I definitely come from a recent transition, just, you know, totally in the academic sphere to now working at a young biotechnology company that would like to become a pharmaceutical company. And there's a lot of, you know, there are a lot of differences in sort of the purposes and the ethical considerations that come with the work that you do in each of those two different spheres. And so I think continuing to engage in these conversations is really important to that. I really like this question of what is the output of science. And I think about this sort of cycle where there's observation leads to generation of theories, leads to predictions that you then, you know, go collect further observations for to validate. And there's this cycle. And one of the things that I think machine learning starts to do is allow a shortcut where you can go directly from observation to prediction to observation to prediction. And it's very easy to do this in a very regressive manner that totally shortcuts any larger scale democratic theory. I agree that theories are more democratic, but you know, there's also this question, right, of, you know, as Pankaj was saying, you know, science is a productive endeavor. And so what is how do we measure the product? There are theories that yield bad predictions, right? You know, and so are there's more democratic than maybe a model, but a deep learning model, but they might still not be as valuable, or the products that they make still might not be as valuable. And so I'm not going to sit here and say that you can go without theory. It's not at all. I think definitely the bias right now is much more towards this, you know, engineering, let's just build things and hopefully they'll work. And then all of a sudden you lead to all of these problems like biases that can be introduced that because you didn't explicitly say not to, and there's a bias in your data set, that you end up with this problem. But I still think this question is, you know, what is the output of science? Is it the observation? Is it the theory? Is it the prediction? Because oftentimes the kinds of situations in which you're developing models and new architectures and new theories, generating new data in an academic sphere, are just very different from people who have a particular problem in the world that they want to address and they want to go solve. And I feel this a lot in the biomedical sphere, but it's also true, you know, you think about marketing as a lot of social science. How do I predict people's behavior? There's a lot of psychology behind that. And people have sometimes found that it's easier to change people's behavior for better or worse using models than just using theory. And you know, I'm not going to say that like this is the perfect thing in the world and that's what we want, but at some point there needs to be an output. And I think that, you know, better ability to make predictions, more generalizability is absolutely good. And all I can really say is that one of the things that I'm trying to do now through this, open problems and cyclical cell analysis effort, which is really focused towards predictive tasks, is at least trying to address this problem of fragility by encouraging democratic inclusion of data, of metrics, of methods, and saying, we're not just going to judge based off of a data set that, for this competition that we're hosting for NeurIPS, we generated the data, but the platform as a whole allows anyone to contribute a new data set, and it becomes very clear when one method does well on one task or another, or with one metric or another. And I think especially also by encouraging people to submit code instead of just submitting predictions, which was actually surprisingly difficult to do and required a substantial amount of sponsorship for us to enable this backend compute that we host. Really enforces this world where people have to be able to take this prediction and at least apply it to a new set of observations, and also run the code themselves so they can start to generate new theories from it and sort of get out of that sort of loop where we're only focusing on the prediction as the output, but the code and the model to actually create those predictions is also the output. I think might get us towards a world where we can make that maybe not as democratic as theory, but closer to that, while still taking some of these benefits.
Well, and I would like to commend you that contest you hosted and supplied compute for people who, when it's scaled beyond what they could do, which, there are also concerns that we might have in terms of that's pushing people. It's like, yeah, the first one is free on the deep learning, using the deep learning pipeline. And it is that's a direction that the community in many ways is sort of being pulled in this direction. Like, these models are very accurate, very powerful, and in a lot of ways easier to build. You just take the data, define your loss function, and throw deep learning at it.
But I just want to point out too, though, like, one of the things we learned in this competition is that sometimes some of the best models are not deep learning models. And they maybe are more interpretable models. And by just making sure everyone is playing on a fair playing ground, you can say, like, well, we're going to limit the amount of resources you can consume, and we find that it's not just these huge over-parameterized networks that people find success with.
Given your background kind of as an industry practitioner, or most industry practitioner for a lot of us, what are your thoughts on, like, the intellectual property argument here, right? Like, if we have to share our code, then it's impossible to, build something that somebody else can't replicate or steal very, very quickly. So how do we proceed if that's a concern, or should it just not be a concern? Should we box that away and find a way to be better scientists?
Yeah, intellectual property considerations are a huge question that I can't claim to have I have a lot of conflicting interpersonal, internal dialogue around. I think, we encourage everyone, we require everyone to use a permissive open source license, so that we can freely reuse their code in any way that we want, so we can test it and validate it. But, also, I work for a company that works in this kind of data, and we're interested in, being able to freely adapt. There's a lot of work that I think almost any industry biotechnology company relies on open source software and contributions from the academy. And all I can say is I feel really lucky that I'm working at a company that values giving back to the community and hosting and helping to organize these kinds of events. But I agree with you. I don't know, maybe Pankaj has some ideas here around the intellectual property considerations and how they might, if they disincentivize certain individuals from engaging in the scientific endeavor.
I would say I come from a completely different perspective. I would say this represents the great privatizations of the commons rather than worrying about individual entrepreneurs, because I think if you take deep learning, right, basically CIFAR, the Canadian Advanced Research Agency kept it alive for 30 years, almost single-handedly. Jeff and these guys had to go beg for money, right? Until it became clear that, actually what they were saying 30 years ago, that bigger neural networks actually work with bigger compute, put it on a GPU until AlexNet, right? And then suddenly there's a frenzy, and I would say a privatization of these means. Even though, yes, PyTorch is an open source thing, you know, TensorFlow is open source, there's a lot of control over that, a lot of appropriation. So I guess I'm not worried about IP that way. I'm much more worried about the fact that there's all this publicly funded research, and then the public has no say over how that's used and does not benefit. And I would say the vaccines, for example, are another. Moderna down the street is another example of the fact that, you know, we are not giving this to the developing world for patent regime reasons. I would say my concern is much more the opposite way. I think innovation will happen. I think, you know, I can just say my former postdoc has a startup, a pretty successful one in Silicon Valley. And he did it because he was curious and he really wanted to do something. And I think most people in these companies like yourself, I imagine, are as much motivated by curiosity and the need to make a tangible impact as any profit motive. So I don't think it's fundamental to the way this has to be organized, though it is the way it is organized. I guess that's all I would say.
I want to, oops, sorry, go ahead. I was just going to add to that conversation just slightly. So after Serena and I wrote this paper, I became very interested in how startups, you know, develop and grow, because we saw so many things that some people were doing really well and some people weren't. And so I joined a venture fund as an associate investor, and the venture fund does a lot of work on they're like Petrie and Pillar, and they do a lot of work with biotech investment. Daniel, you're nodding your head. Do you know Petrie?
Yeah, I've talked to Tony Kalisa a couple of times. He seems really like wants to engage in the community. It's a cool organization.
Yeah, he's lovely. So I was just going to say that a lot of the things that are open source are actually iterated on and built on, just like what you were describing, where people can still commercialize off of things that should be, in my mind, like truly available to the public. Things that you know, are knowledge based, you can still build products on, and I think those products are often very like successful and tangible, more so than trying to build something fairly theoretical, personally.
And Daniel, you said, you know, your hope is to become a pharmaceutical company, right? Which implies you're going to
company's hope. I personally am okay with not.
Well, I mean, so below that, like any of us, I mean, I think most of us a lot of us who work in biology, I won't say any of us, some of it's curiosity, some of it's desire to, you know, have a positive impact on people through understanding and helping to cure disease, right? Which is what pharmaceutical companies are supposed to be doing. I mean, from one side, from another side, they're supposed to make money. But to get to that point does involve trade-offs. And one of those trade-offs is certainly like finding enough funding and privatizing knowledge enough to be able to fund the tests to make sure that something that could help people can be developed, right? And yeah. I think there's the same case with, you know, if we talk about deep learning to help people, getting to the point where that can be done may, you know, in the system that we're operating in, might also require some of those trade-offs. I don't know if you have other thoughts on that or someone else does.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, when we talk about wanting to bring a drug into the clinic, right, there are a lot of people I know who just want a new therapy for their family member who has cancer. And I think, you know, there's a lot of people who really have illnesses and have unmet need. And just running a clinical trial can cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Like just, you know, not taking into account target discovery or any of the other experiments, it's just literally bringing people together to monitor patients and to administer a new drug is incredibly expensive. And, you know, personal politics aside, you know, some of us may be happy to have the government just anytime someone wants to do this, you know, say there's going to be an academic panel and we'll say, okay, we're going to give you, you know, $400 million to do this clinical study. But I don't know, like at some point we need to bring that money together, and the people who seem to have that and be willing to do that are work in for-profit companies that have large amounts of capital, or venture capital firms that have lots of money to administer, like, you know, and the NIH budget just doesn't have money to pay for our company to go off and do a clinical trial whenever we want. And I don't know, it's definitely complicated. I get this problem of, like, you know, we come together with a lot of funding. This competition was like, you know, $200,000 of data generation and a lot of expertise. And we had a lot of decisions that we got to make, like, as a, you know, a group of organizers, which was, you know, we invited the community to sort of get involved, and there are people who have come together and really stepped up in contributing their thoughts to this. But at the end of the day, like, we are a close, you know, group of people who made a decision, and like that now impacts like a bunch of other people who went and did science this fall. And like, I feel ambivalent about that, because I'm sure that I don't necessarily have the best idea for how to drive science forward. I'm hoping that I'm at least directionally correct. That would be good enough for me.
I just want to chime in real quickly. First, just to appreciate and maybe even revel in the wide-ranging and spiraling nature of this conversation. Very fun. But also, just to say, the way, what we've been describing, especially with regards to intellectual property and privatization, and how we currently as a society invest in commercialization or distribution or translation of scientific knowledge into stuff that is accessible outside of a theory. You know, we are describing the way that the world is currently organized. And I think one thing that I try and reiterate quite often is that there are other ways that the world could be organized. And one thing that Pankaj in particular was pointing out, that, you know, the way the world is currently organized is not the only way where innovation happens, which is something I think that people kind of casually say without any evidence whatsoever, or at least in a way that won't withstand 30 seconds worth of careful scrutiny. So, you know, just that there are other ways to organize the world. And so it's important to think about what are, you know, what are the consequences of the current way the world is organized? What motives are being served? What populations are not being served? Who is contributing to the directions of science, and so on. So, and again, in light of the fact that there are other ways to organize the world, some of them are more difficult to achieve on short time scales, and some of them are, you know, whatever. Obviously, some of them require reorganizing society entirely, and others are things that an individual could affect within their life. So yes, that was thing number one. And I guess, I don't know if we want to continue on that topic. I was going to slightly get back to this question of what are like biological theories, and relating that to meaningful representations of life in the realm of a particular interest of mine that also relates to a lot of the stuff that Daniel's been talking about, in especially looking at genomics data and expression and organizing large amounts of information to find patterns. So, you know, just one particular example is in something that I've contributed to quite negatively in the following sense, is just a sort of very shallow discussion of what we call gene modules or cellular pathways. And these are things that are talked about as though they mean something, but I actually have no idea what they mean outside of like a column in a matrix factorization or a fancier version of the same thing. So having those directly connected to some organizing theory of how cells work, you know, is an extremely useful exercise. And I'm not sure what one of my concerns with the field, and again, where I've been contributing negatively with regards to my current comment, is that there's tons and tons of work on fancier and fancier ways to sort of organize the patterns of gene modules across cells in bigger and bigger data sets and so on, and create different visualizations and classify things as this or that. And almost no effort at the same time to say what the heck that thing is that we're talking about, the cellular pathway or the gene module, in terms of a theoretical description. And I don't think it's the case at all that, you know, biology is too complicated. This is one sort of refrain you'll hear, is that it's just too complicated, or it's arisen from historical process and so defies theoretical possibilities or theoretical categorization. I reject that. I don't think that that's true at all. The sort of absence of a theory in this particular regard, I think, is more related to, well, I mean, not to say that the problem's easy or difficult, but just that that's not where we're investing resources as a community at the moment. And I think that, again, one can think about why are we not investing resources in that particular direction, and that relates to the entire previous discussion that we've had. And again, the connections of science to all of the rest of the way that we organize society. I had one other thing to say, but I forgot, so I'll shut up for a minute.
So Brian, in your mind, are these learned representations kind of, it almost sounds like you're describing building interpretability into the way that like molecular interactions within a cell are described and learned by a model. Is that what you're thinking when you say these representations?
Well, so, right. So what I think would be useful, how this will happen, I'll connect back to like, how can ML contribute to this? But I think that starting from sort of some principles, okay, at a microscopic scale and rigorously connecting those across scales to describe emergent phenomena, at a more macroscopic scale, is a useful thing. And what constitutes a theory? Okay, so it might involve the thing that I just said. And I don't know that I have the final definition for all time. What came up previously in the discussion with Daniel, is that the theory is not merely defined as something that produces a testable and well-defined hypothesis. I don't think that is like the definition of useful or meaningful theory. In the end, what we want is okay, so what I'm about to say is considerably more broad, but we want something that changes how we think and what we do in the context of a particular question. And again, I happen to think it's a particularly useful theory. Again, this is not inclusive on its own, if it's particularly communicable across scales, geographically or across generations. And of course, it actually needs to be related. It's not going to capture the fundamental truth of the universe in its entirety, but hopefully, should not be offensively wrong. So, some relationship with the truth that's a little bit more rigorous than whatever definition I just did or didn't give. Right. Specifically with cellular pathways, what the heck would that even mean? It might, for example, incorporate actual physical constraints on the system. So one of my complaints about the way we talk about gene modules and cellular pathways right now, there's almost always absolutely no connection between the parts of a system. So for example, the activity of some cellular pathway or gene module is not constrained in relation to the activity of the others in any way that, again, is derived from any physical constraints on the system or mathematical constraints or whatever else. If there are such constraints on how one thing could behave in relation to another, it's almost always done for computational convenience, right? Like we need something to add up to 1, or we need things to be orthogonal because we have issues with identifiability in our algorithm, but not done so in a way that derives from some sort of biological knowledge. Okay, and there's a real problem with this because, it sort of reduces things. No, it's very reductive, right? I mean, it sort of says, all right, there are things that behave together. So we've acknowledged that there's a group of genes that are co-regulated, or there's a group of genes that act together functionally. So we've taken one step towards things are interacting within the cell, but then sort of failed to take that step again at the level of the things that are interacting together or that are co-regulated together. How are they acting in relation to all the other things that are co-regulated? And I think until we start to at least make attempts towards, you could call it a more ecological perspective, then we'll have a sort of course we'll have an incomplete, but it's a meaningfully incomplete, a somewhat shallow description of how cells are working that is harming our, harming scientific progress, which is sort of a nebulous thing to say. But nonetheless, I think it's detrimental until we start making concerted efforts towards that kind of more, again, just because I said it, ecological perspective on how cells are working. Then I think we're going to be missing out on a lot of insights about how things are working. And it makes things very difficult, like if you talk about doing GWAS studies, right? If you have a GWAS, you have a large population and you want to go from some mutation in the gene, or you want to go from a polygenic risk score to a behavior or a disease susceptibility or any other phenotype. I think doing that in the absence of, and planning to do that for the foreseeable future, in the absence of any attempts at a theory which connect things rigorously across scales from individual nucleotides in the genome to how cells are working and how cells behave together in tissues and how humans behave together and how humans interact with their environment. No theoretical connection across any of those scales sort of seems wild, and I think it's inherently limiting for the prospects of sort of personalized genomic medicine, any of that kind of stuff. If we don't, again, make a concerted effort to engage in that type of science.
I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but one of the things that I just have a couple of questions about what you just said, which is, you know, I think often it is exceptionally easy to model things at a very low level, and it is relatively easy to model things at a very high level. But once you start adding additional layers in between that you have to interpolate across, it introduces ridiculous complexity, right? And what you're describing is building systems that do that work. And one question I have is, how common is it within machine learning for biology to do things like ensembling models, or looking at how you can kind of compose different models that do specific things in kind of a long-term outcome to do some of this more complex predictive work?
Anyone else want to comment, or? Oh, good, Pankaj.
I'll just say it's fairly common. As a physicist, one of the things I find confusing is the conflation between a statistical model and a biophysical model that happens a lot in the computational biology community. I would just say, I think part of what I would like to know about learning meaningful representations of what I've learned from physics, where if you think about what Newton's laws unify, it's very hard for me to ever imagine a neural network figuring that out. No matter how many contexts you gave it, how much data you gave it, you know, everything. And that's because it's not a statistic, it's not a model based on statistics, right? And so what I'd like to know is, statistics is certainly useful, but what can't you do with machine learning? Like, I think one way of framing this question is, what can we never imagine doing with these kind of, whatever, latent embeddings, whatever you want to take, you know? And I would say they're very bad at handling context, because as you change the context, you give it new data. This is, you know, you're going out of samples slightly, And at some point, you just have so much data, you're just memorizing everything. And so I think one way of focusing the question is, what can't we imagine we can learn about biology by measuring all this stuff and then throwing a statistical model of any kind at it? Because I would claim that's a big, big, big sphere. And one of the things that I would say is really important in physics is a language. Like, statistical models reify knowledge, but they reify knowledge in a very different way from the way theories reify knowledge. It's hard to communicate, right? As everyone's been pointing out. But I don't think that's just a byproduct. I think it's implicit in the way the system is being modeled and thought about. So I think that's a symptom of a much bigger lacuna in our way of thinking about it. So I guess that's what I want to throw out to people. What do you think you can't do with these kind of deep learning things for biological systems in particular, but maybe even beyond biological systems, right? Like, so there's probably a Venn diagram of stuff that's not possible in biology, but there's also probably stuff that's not possible outside of biology. And I think it would be interesting to understand that, and maybe that'll help us understand what a meaningful representation is. But ensemble models people use every statistical model you can think of basically now is the answer. Any kind of statistics, if there's a paper at ICML or NeurIPS or ICLR, it's in some biological context within a year, is what is my experience.
I'm actually kind of curious. I'd like to follow up. I think you a couple of times now have mentioned this problem of memorization, and I can't claim to be like a real expert in whether, like, to what degree we think deep models memorize. And my background really is actually in the life sciences, not computer science. But I know that there are questions around this double descent model of over parameterized learning regimes, and like there's a lot of talk there about how it's actually really not memorization, but really effective interpolation. And then Jan LeCun just came out with a paper talking about how in high dimensions, like everything falls out of the convex hull of the data that you trained on. So actually we're never interpolating, we're always extrapolating, but neither of those are memorizing. And so I'm interested to know if you can maybe just talk a little bit more about this idea of memorization and meaning.
Okay, I meant memorization much more in that interpolation to me is a form of clever memorization, because it's very hard to go so far out of sample, right? So the bias variance trade-off doesn't apply. That's what in the classical way we thought in the underparameterized regime. So I would say, to my understanding of neural networks, there's basically three basic problems that were in statistical learning theory, which is that why can we learn at all with so many parameters, right? And the answer to that seems to be from double descent and all this stuff, that actually double descent, the bias variance trade-off, we got it wrong. As you add more parameters, the variance actually goes back down. This is true for linear regression. This is true for a fancy model. It's true for random forest. Second question is, how do you generalize beyond the training data set? How do you deal with the fact that the training data set is not representative of the whole thing? And there seems to be a large body of theory suggesting that stochastic gradient descent, various regularizations, basically take you to, broad minima that generalize better. I think the third question is the one that's more concerned about this, which is that, are the features you learn meaningful or more different, right? How much is embedded in the feature, right? So we know in the infinite width limit, you have the neural tangent kernel. It looks basically like a linear model. Those features aren't very interpretive. So I think I would argue that's the place where the weakest, theoretically, in deep learning, at least from my reading. Look, I'm a dilettante, but we have our papers on this stuff, but I'm a dilettante. And I think that's the thing we're trying to do in biology the most. And so it's this kind of very funny intersection where the part we understand the best theoretically is the automation part, which is that we can learn high dimensional functionals from million dimensions to million dimensions, which 20 years ago, you told me that, I would have told you that's nonsense, right? That was the dogma. But I think whether the features we learn are super meaningful, right? The best work on that is still actually pre all this Hinton stuff. It's all the stuff from computational neuroscience about sparse representations, all the stuff from the late 90s and early 2000s. And even there, in the context of neuroscience, it wasn't clear, right? And there you were just trying to learn filters in a very simple setting. So I would say, like, those are the three problems. And when I say memorization, what I really mean is that it's very hard to interpolate much beyond the training data set I give you. So in biology, that's really important, because like the kind of data we generate is actually a lot of I think organisms fundamentally are things that interact with their environments. The data we generate is in a very particular environment. Even the environment being the lab you generate, which is minor, disappears. So I think that represents just a fundamental problem for trying to learn meaningful representation. The thing I would say we understand the least about deep learning is the most important for biology. And that's my personal view, but I've babbled for too long already.
Aspen, you wanted to had a question?
Yeah, I was just going to respond to one particular thing, which is, there's been a little bit of recent work that is, I think, very exciting about generalizing from the specific paper I'm thinking of is called, it's a Grokking paper. It's called Grokking Generalization Beyond Overfitting on Small Algorithmic Data Sets. And in this context, they basically take a very small data set, they train a model, and they train the model to what should be overfitting, and then they train past that. And all of a sudden, once they get past this point, there's a change that happens within the weighting, and it suddenly generalizes perfectly. And so things that the model actually hadn't been exposed to from the training data, it was able to correctly characterize and produce an output for it. And I think that this is a a potentially hopeful thing for the future of deep learning. I think I have some questions on whether it's something that can be extended when you're working with very large data sets, because it takes a lot of computational, it takes a lot of computation to train so far past overfitting. I'm happy to share that paper as well, but I do think it offers something interesting about, you know, there's a possibility that some of this isn't just a memorization, or it isn't just inference. It can be, there might be some base truth representation that can be learned if given enough samples in enough ways. But again, that's very new. I think that paper came out in the last year. And so there's plenty of questions to still be asked about it.
Along with that, there was a recent paper, I mean, and a little bit to the side of that, there was a recent paper by Judy Gachoya and another group, and her group on X-ray, basically X-ray identification. They took X-ray data from that's available now from COVID, and tried to identify self-identified race from X-rays of lungs. That's all. Did a lot of ablation experiments, downsampling of the images, and found that these models, along with maybe being accurate at identifying COVID, could also identify self-identified race in patients, which they didn't say anything prescriptive about it or anything like that. They just pointed this out. So these complicated models are also learning other things, some of which we may not necessarily, we certainly wouldn't want to include race in, if we're trying to figure out how do you treat someone, given historical inequities in treatment. We don't want to sort of reproduce that. How do we, along with these meaningful representations, how do we guard against bad meaningful learning or representations? Right? It's very easy to do that in a theory. Right, something simple. You can say, okay, it doesn't take into account race when we make these decisions, though there may be, of course, biological biases that should still be considered. But in biology and medicine, if we apply these sort of opaque models, how do we actively guard against problems like that? Is a question I have. I don't know if anyone has thoughts or opinions or.
Well, it raises another question for me, which is sort of as a deep learning practitioner, I often look to randomized controlled trials as the gold standard in how we should be assessing, you know, not just drugs and things, but also models, right? Like, what better tool do we have? And so I guess, like, given this room, I want to hear whether, you know, people think that there's a nugget of an answer in that, like if that type of study can help us with these type of evaluations, or if you think that RCTs aren't, you know, what we should be aiming for in deep learning, but we need, you know, something beyond that, more, yeah.
I mean, well, and RCTs, like oh, so Daniel, you have thoughts.
Oh, I was just going to respond to this question around like, what do we and don't we want to learn? And I think like there's a, you know, my first response was like, well, are we sure that we don't want to include, like, why do we say we don't want, you know, a model to learn differences between self-identified race? Because I think, you know, there are clinical covariates of self-identified race, and saying we want to ignore that might mean that you know, don't treat someone with the best possible care that they could have. And knowing, you know, family medical histories, for example, right now is really important for providing standard of care. And I agree, like I think an easier maybe place to talk about this is outside of medicine, but maybe in hiring, there's like a lot of conversation right now around algorithmic biases and like resume prioritization algorithms. And I think, you know, in my mind, the best way that you know, can protect against this is you need sort of like an adversarial system where you have people who know what are the kinds of things we definitely don't want to discriminate against, right? We actually have articulated these a lot in equal employment opportunities in the United States. And I think you just need to like, you can't just assume that that's going to happen. You need people who are actually like positively demonstrating that those biases don't exist. And I'm not sure how without them, you know, you'll be able to make sure that they're not present in your predictive model. And there's going to have to be an ethical review to know what exactly are the kinds of tests that we want to make to show that, you know, we want to make sure these two people get prescribed the same care, for example, or prioritized in the same way. I don't know. That's my 2 cents.
I think one thing that's important to remember on this topic, you know, it's not so much possible to create the universally unbiased model. Like you just cannot erase all biases from the model. So I think it's important to be aware of the ones that, you know, have historically had incredibly negative consequences for certain populations, and not just historically, but ongoing negative consequences for certain populations, and definitely try and minimize those. But also, again, to say that we shouldn't restrict ourselves to the framing of the question of, we're going to definitely keep doing things the way we are now, but try and make our models a little bit less biased, right? Like you're super limited in the possibility of solutions and the scope of the solutions, if that's the entirety of the framing of the question. And so, you know, that there's lots of different ways to think about the problem. For me, one handy one is who has sort of power over determining what studies are done and how those studies and the products of the science are distributed to people. And if we have incredible inequities in determining the directions and the outputs and the applications of science, then I would say the possibilities of sort of eliminating racial or other biases in healthcare or something like that are relatively slim. If we only apply sort of attempts at debiasing our algorithms or debiasing our data sets, but don't address those sort of larger scale systemic inequities in power.
One of the things that, just quickly, Daniel, I think adversarial learning is a really great tool for trying to achieve fairness. I know that there's been some work on looking at recidivism predictions with that context. And so I'm sure that there's wonderful ways that you can extend that to like the medical context. I do think that, I'm sorry, the wind is so loud. So if you hear the door shuttering, that is howling wind outside. The city of Boston is an exciting place to be. One thing I think is really interesting about what Brian just said, which is, can we also consider the systems that exist and how to moderate them or modify them, I guess, such that we have consequences that are more optimal? I'm really curious why you can't frame outcomes, like model outcomes, as like, oh, you know, one thing that's something to be aware of is that this person, this is maybe going to be a little bit bold and unsubstantiated, but I'm curious why we can't inform people who are looking at model outputs in a way that causes them to be reflexive about their behavior, right? So, and by that, I mean like considerate of like self-reflection and contextualization of what, if we're talking about someone who is historically been marginalized, or is like, maybe we're talking about a Black woman who's pregnant, right? To make this a real thing. And, you know, there's a risk that this person might have high blood pressure or something like that while pregnant. Why can't we frame this as part of the outcome, right? Why can't we frame this as part of like the thing that we're giving the doctor is like contextualization of the output to allow them to have more facets on which to make a decision, and also things to communicate to their patients. This is again operating under the assumption that we're talking about medical data. I'm sure there are other things, but.
Yeah, and I mean, if I understand correctly, again, I don't think there's, like, I wouldn't necessarily argue against providing that sort of context, the context that we think has been missing often or somehow is directly related, causal or not, to unequal outcomes. And similarly with like input data to a model. I think making attempts at debiasing those or not being as egregious in unequal outcomes or unequal treatment of populations, we should definitely be doing. Again, my point was rather that we should not restrict the scope of our solutions because it will restrict the sort of, possibilities of what we can actually remedy.
What was the book you just shared?
Oh, yeah. I'm just saying there's a long history of the idea of racism and lung science and presumptions of corrections that have to be done for race. This is a book that just came out called Breathing Race into the Machine that traces like a 100-year lineage. And I think one of the things maybe we don't appreciate is that these problems that we view as new technological problems that are due to deep learning are actually very old problems that have reoccurred over and over again. And no, I mean, I think it's just not the first time where people think that, you know, there's racial corrections and what we should do. I personally am completely against racialized medicine of any kind. I think it's a social category, and you know, as opposed to a biological category. And it's one we record, but I think it highlights the main thing that we can only build statistical models on things we record. And I would say that's the big lacuna of all this stuff. We measure genes, we don't measure proteins. We measure genes, we don't measure environments. We measure genes, we don't measure social interactions. How meaningful a representation can you learn? And okay, you learn some correlate for some other thing in some particular thing. I think that's not surprising, right? I can tell you people's outcome by telling you tell me their zip code. I can tell you many things about them with very high accuracy, right? I don't know. I'm just saying these are old problems, and I think it's part of it is to learn the history of the people before us who thought about them. I think deep learning is both amazingly novel, but also kind of the same problem we've been dealing with for a long time with how to interface with technology and data and statistics, right? Like the history of statistics is kind of very interesting, right? Because it comes out of eugenics. Like that is its origins. And they're brilliant people, right? And they're applying it to eugenics. So it's kind of, I don't know, it's interesting. But not new, the problems, I would say, is the only thing I think we should keep in mind.
Do you think collecting more information around context is the solution? Or because that seems like a step in the right direction, but maybe is not the perfect answer. And by that, I mean, if you're talking about zip code, you know, my family has a history of autoimmune diseases. And part of that, I think, is because they lived near, they lived in Florida, and the water level was extremely high, and there was a dump nearby. And so I don't have any reason to know that factually, but, you know, almost my entire family on my mom's side has autoimmune diseases, and that's pretty uncommon. But there's not really a way to communicate that to like there's not a way to really easily document that in my medical history, without saying like, oh, everyone has this, but it's because possibly this location.
I think more data is better. I don't think more data gets us to where I think people want it to get us. And again, I just go, you know, again, I just draw on my experience as physics. It's hard for me to imagine modern physical theory proceeding if we stopped at collecting data and doing statistics on it. You know, it's just dogma. It's my dogmatic belief that more context is always better, but it's unclear we're going to bootstrap our way to theory from more context and more measurements, is I guess what I would say.
So one of the things that, oh, sorry, Daniel, go ahead.
Oh, no, I sort of had a question. It was just pulled off of things that Brian and you, Aspen, had talked about before, but I can wait if you want to make another, wrap this up. So one of the things I would love to just hear the group talk a little bit about, it, you know, sort of getting at this question of like, what is science? What is meaningful? What is, you know, what are the things that we do that actually change the way we think about the world? And part of this is colored by the fact that I've been really enjoying watching the new Foundation series, and I loved those books and like really fell in love with that universe. And I remember in in the novels, one of the things Asimov wrote about was this world where scientists stop going out and collecting data and developing new theories, but rather just reanalyzing old results and coming up with new predictions, whatever, based off of it. Very recursive way of doing, what we may or may not consider research. And, I think a lot about how we think that it would be great if we just had like a black box that would allow us to just do predictions of like what would happen to a cell if I did X, like if I perturbed this module or like this gene or turned this on or off, and like those kinds of predictions we think would be great if I could just open up my computer. We don't need to go like sacrifice mice or even like culture cells that are incredibly expensive. If everyone could just do those predictions at home and like, then only do the one thing that we're not sure about, that it would make science, a lot more accessible and easier to do. But I'm sort of interested to know if the group thinks like that kind of thing, having this black box that like could make really great predictions, if inspecting that is in itself science, and if there's like a fundamental problem with using that as part of a research tool or not.
Well, coming from the robotics world, I'll say high fidelity simulators are incredibly hard to come by. It's still a dream, even for systems that we really, really understand quite well, right? Like, robots are not that complicated. And yeah, it's just so far from where we are right now, even in that like much simpler domain. It's almost impossible for me to imagine it for like the world that you all occupy. Yeah, other opinions there?
I think one place where it is more, it's specifically related to that point, because I think you sort of hit it head on in biology. I'm not quite sure, but there are some things that we can simulate okay, but big complex systems, I don't quite know. There are simulations of individuals, equali cells and stuff like that. But anyway, what I wanted to mention was at the sort of interface of ML and theory, there's more work recently on not generating, but encouraging the investigation of certain mathematical conjectures through the use of ML, right? So training supervised models that learn a relationship between two different representations of a signal, and somehow using that, again, that does not on its own produce directly, typically, at least as far as I understand, it's not my field of research, directly a conjecture, but can at least encourage one to go investigate or invest their time in something. And I know that there's also a little bit of work on similarly, or maybe the analogy is bad, but also applying ML to look for certain mathematical constants and things like that. In the biological realm, I don't think, no, I mean, Daniel, your specific question of is there anything fundamentally wrong with using like a black box in the course of science, or using some sort of inscrutable predictability machine in the course of doing science? I'm not sure, I don't personally, find that offensive. What I do find offensive is that occupies, the idea that would occupy a large part of what it means to do science, meaning that the entirety of what we do as a scientific community is to build those big predictive machines. By entirety, I mean mostly that's what we do, or at least it occupies a large part of our psyche. That part I definitely do find offensive, but just using such machines and making predictions or doing simulations in the course of doing science otherwise, I don't, seems normal.
Well, to call back to what Pankaj showed at the very beginning, I mean, Tycho Brahe's tables were, not exactly the same thing. You could, Newton couldn't go in and change a number and see how the other numbers would change, but in a lot of ways was a very, or Kepler couldn't go in and change those. It was a very sort of descriptive, like, this is what I see. Here are a whole bunch of different conditions where I've observed planets and what they do. And then people came along and looked at it. So I mean, as a biologist or someone thinking about this, I would, that would be useful. I don't think it would be totally, totally inscrutable, because then we could go in and poke certain things and come up with theories and poke it and then go and poke actual cells and make sure the model is correct. So I think it would be useful. Is it going to be, again, is it, there's a choice. As we've said, building that model would be very difficult, take a lot of effort. Would there be better things to work on? Possibly. I don't know. That's a choice, and I think a lot of this conversation has been, okay, let's contextualize what we think about the efforts we're putting in, and think about the costs and the trade-offs, and be aware that all of these will involve that. We've been talking for almost an hour, and it's been great. I don't want to take up too much more time, and we have limited time at the workshop to show this unless I put it on sort of high-speed playback. So I would just ask that everyone, if you have some sort of closing statement, or just whatever you'd like to say in the next 10 or so minutes, that we wrap up. It's been great to mostly sit back and listen to this. So thank you again. Does anyone want to sort of lead off any sort of closing thoughts?
I can start. There's sort of aberrations from what we've talked about so far, but a couple of things that I'm really passionate around MIT are trying to train scientists to work with legislators. So I think that, starting pretty early in your scientific training, you should question what you want to do with that work. I think it's great to become a scientist and to contribute to the scientific record. But I also think there's a lot of space to kind of use that knowledge to help people who are, figuring out what the science budget should be, try to advocate for better and more meaningful ways of work for the community and not just as an individual. So pretty bullish on that. And then the other thing is ethics training. So sometimes I find it frustrating that we, kind of focus our ethics training on individual personal responsibility when we do exist in these systems that, we do need to critique, as Brian has said several times throughout this conversation. But nonetheless, I think that that's a really important part of all of this too. And so I think thinking about ethics from an individual perspective and learning about it, and perhaps if you're, an educator, learning how to teach it and including that in your courses are some of the most immediately impactful things that we can do as scientists.
Pankaj, can I point at you for summing up next?
Yeah, I just appreciate the space to have this discussion. I think I just like to emphasize that science and technology is embedded, though it's definitely something about truth, is also embedded with social relations. And it's helpful to think about why we ask the questions we do, what the goal of the questions we ask are. And I would say deep learning and biology, this intersection, is a place where that's probably especially important, because it's especially close to commodity production. And the profit motive is a strong one in our society. And it can both be harnessed for producing something good, but it can also lead, and I would, in my opinion, often does lead to many unwanted side effects, both intellectually and socially, and it's worth keeping those in mind.
I can go. I saw you, the precursors of a B on your lips there, Ray. So I'll just, anyway, I also had an excellent time here discussing with you all, very fun conversation. I think partially just reiterating what Pankaj just said, we can ask meaningful for whom when we talk about learning meaningful representations of life. And one thing that I think we talked about, what is the purpose? How do we think about scientific progress? My sort of definition, but please only consider it as Brian's definition of science. Nobody else should subscribe to this, or at least be required to subscribe to it, is that the goal of science is to enable a more or less egalitarian society in which people are free to engage with whatever is meaningful to them. And so the ways that science can do this are to achieve scientific and technological advancements that reduce the amount of time that we're required to spend laboring, right? And so we can do other things with our lives, or to enable people to just plain live longer and healthier lives. There are scientific advancements that also allow us to understand, maintain, and cultivate the natural environment, or just to better understand our place in the world and in the universe more broadly. So that's how I think about science, which maybe would have been useful context before all the rambling I did throughout the discussion today. And I think returning to what is the purpose of science and who is participating in the directions of science and who is benefiting from science in the context of that definition, for me, is super useful and helps guide thoughts about things like what is a meaningful representation of this or that biological system. But anyway, I appreciate everything everyone had to say, and yeah, had a great time.
I'm happy to go next. So I guess, of course, this was a really great opportunity to take a little bit of step back from the day-to-day, getting work done, and really thinking about how we're getting work done and why we're getting work done. And so I'm excited to sort of take that back as I, think about what I'm going to spend the rest of my week and month on. I think about, meaning here in a lot of the same ways I think about this idea of like, what does a meaningful life look like? And, how do we make sure that we're doing the most possible good in the time that we have? And I think, what's really useful is to have a set of guiding principles and callings that we use to sort of drive us, because we do live in a world and a society today which has a lot of competing and conflicting interests. And I think a lot of, in biomedicine, especially when we talk about meaning there, I think at least one of the stated callings is to improve the lives of other people, and thinking about, now this problem, like what if we don't necessarily know the right way to do that? I feel like, one of the nice things is there's a lot of people here on this planet, and trying to focus on maybe just being okay with going in the right direction. And whenever you face opportunities, to take a step back and think, back to those principles and ethics that we can use to sort of guide us. And so I think it's always a moving target, and this examination that we have today is like a crucial part of making sure that we, are doing this in the right way.
Okay, I'll finish up then. I think Brian said something really lovely earlier, which is meaningful to who. And that can come from, that question can be prompted at many places in development and in research. I think taking that first step, even before you collect data, to ask what is the meaning in the data that I'm collecting, and who am I representing with this data? If we make statistical inferences from this, that will have long-term consequences, ensuring that even from the beginning that this is a little bit more representative of, all variations that we anticipate being impacted by the tools that we build, that is the case early on. And then, even beyond that, we've talked a lot about learned representations within the context of very complex systems. And I think that there's still more to be learned by taking a step back and looking at more simplistic contexts and understanding those even more, and then attempting to generalize from that. So as we continue to think about what is learned and what representations are of value, I think going back to the basics will be very beneficial. So thank you.
Thank you again to all the panelists. That was really wonderful. I really appreciate this. I encourage the people watching to build off this conversation, to have your own conversations about your work, and to think about, as you go forward as a machine learning researcher or a biologist or scientist in general, that you evaluate and, take that step back, both in terms of thinking about your models, but also about your work. And I think a lot of ideas and thoughts mentioned today are really excellent guides for that. So again, thank you to all of you. Thank you to our attendees at the workshop, and enjoy the rest of the workshop as it goes.